Welcome to this iteration of the Paul Rand Lecture Series. I'm Jeff Kaplan, Professor of Record of the course Graphic Design History, a set of alternatives. First, let's start from the beginning. Yale University acknowledges that indigenous peoples and nations, including Mohegan, Massatucket Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Golden Hill Powagset, Hatchet, and Quinnipiac and other Algonquin-speaking peoples have stewarded through generations the lands and waterways, what is now the state of Connecticut. We honor and respect the enduring relationship that exists between these peoples and nations in this land. The upcoming lecture we're about to participate in is part of class Graphic Design History, a set of alternatives. The class examines the role of alternative and underground media in the formation of social movements in the United States, with a particular focus on graphic design. We study the ways in which collective practices graphically fashion the image of a culture, especially in times of pronounced and systematic cultural and political change. The class treats design practices of the 1960s to the present as continuous with a range of activist strategies as a vehement challenges to the dominance of official media and a critical form of self-representation. It's now my pleasure to introduce one of the three instructors of the class. Along with me and Nicole Killian, Alex Fialho is a PhD candidate in Yale University's combined PhD program in the history of art and African American studies. He is currently a critical studies fellow at the esteemed Whitney Museum the Whitney Museum Independent Studies Program in New York City. As an art historian and curator, Alex's research and writing focuses on modern and contemporary art, Black feminist and queer theory, and AIDS cultural studies. Fialho's dissertation thinks through photography by African American artists and archives of their work as apertures into AIDS-related art histories. Fialho worked for 5 years as programs director of the New York-based arts nonprofit Visual AIDS, facilitating projects around the history and immediacy of the ongoing AIDS pandemic, while intervening against the widespread whitewashing of HIV/AIDS cultural narratives. As an oral historian of the Smithsonian Archives of American Arts, Visual Arts, and AIDS Epidemic, an oral history project, he conducted extensive oral histories with 15 cultural producers, including Greg Bordowitz, Douglas Crimpton, Nan Golden, and Lyle Ashton Harris. Alex is wholly invested in his research as a rising scholar, but I underscore how his academic work is inseparable from his ethics, generosity, and contributions to many communities in which he circulates. In this regard, Alex is a model instructor for this course. Alex.
Thanks so much. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Alex Fialho. Thank you, Jeff, for your introduction. And thank you, Jeff and Nancy, for the invitation to teach a 3-week module in the Graphic Design Histories course in the Yale School of Art. I also want to thank our colleagues from across Yale, particularly the School of Public Health, for joining us today, which points to the wide-ranging audiences for Avram Finkelstein's work. For the 3 weeks I'm teaching, we're focusing on graphic design and activism within queer communities and AIDS activist collectives. As soon as Jeff reached out to me to teach, I immediately knew I had to invite Avram Finkelstein to speak to our class. And it's my privilege and pleasure to introduce Avram for the Paul Rand Lecture Series. A note of housekeeping first. Avram will give his lecture, which will be followed by a Q&A, so please be thinking of questions. Feel free to raise your Zoom hand or write to me or Nancy that you'd like to ask a question, or send us your question directly. The Zoom will go until 5 p.m. Eastern, after which the students in our class will remain on Zoom to have time to speak further with Avram as part of our course. We'll take the final question around 4:50, 4:55 Eastern. Now to introduce Avram Finkelstein. In short, Avram's work, both collective and individual, has changed the world. Abram is an artist, writer, and a founding member of the Silence Equals Death and Gran collectives. It's hard to imagine a visual landscape of AIDS activism before Silence Equals Death. And that is in part because Silence Equals Death was so instrumental in galvanizing a queer collective response to AIDS. Created by a collective of 6 gay men out of a self-initiated support group around AIDS-related loss, the Silence Equals Death Collective designed the posters that they then paid for to be wheat-pasted anonymously in Manhattan, which shortly thereafter became central to the messaging of the AIDS activist collective ACT UP, the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power. Abram's work has shown at MoMA, the Whitney Museum, the Metropolitan Museum, the Brooklyn Museum, and the Shed, and is in the permanent collections of MoMA, the Whitney, the New Museum, the Metropolitan, the Victoria and Albert Museum, and the Brooklyn Museum. He's a recipient of a 2024 Creative Capital Grant and a 2023 Pollock Krasner Grant. He is featured in the Artist Oral History Project of the Smithsonian Archives of American Art, and he is the author of the book for UC Press, After Silence, A History of AIDS Through Its Images, which we are reading for our class. Personally, Avram's book, After Silence, is the most impactful book I've read about art, activism, and AIDS, and I'm excited to continue assigning it and reading it in community for future classes in AIDS-related contexts. I'll close on a personal note. When I was in my early 20s, having recently completed undergrad, I co-curated an exhibition of safer sex posters with artist Dorian Katz from the collection of Buzz Bentz, another mentor, at the Center for Sex and Culture in San Francisco. I excitedly, nervously reached out to Avram, whose work had inspired me deeply, to ask if we could reproduce the Silence Equals Death poster in the catalog. Ever since that initial correspondence, Avram's generosity and thoughtfulness has been at the heart of our conversations and collaborations for over a decade. Thank you for your work and wisdom, Avram. We are all very excited to hear from you today.
Oh my God, I'm fighting tears. Thank you for that very kind introduction. And thanks to everyone for joining us. Thanks to Alex and Nancy and Jeff and everyone else at Yale for inviting me to share in this conversation with you today. I'm going to echo some of the things that have already been said by Alex. I'd like to consider some of the ways images are deployed to drive political agency in an image commons. So I'm going to be taking a view from 50,000 feet. And I'd like to also think about how our digital landscape has changed the ways in which we think about ourselves and explore some ideas about making meaning in a culture that's based on images in the 21st century. I'll be referencing a range of images and ideas, but I also intend to downshift into and take a critical overview of one particular image, the Silence Equals Death image, which I had a hand in creating, because it's frequently referred to as a representative example of political communication within our shared spaces, and it underscores some of the points I'd like to explore today. As Alex has pointed out, most of the work I'm known for was designed to promote social justice organizing. And that aspect of my practice is kind of a high wire act that deploys the language of capitalism to wage a resistance to it, and repurposing the mechanisms used for institutional dominance. So I'll be covering a lot of conceptual ground and darting around between theory, pop culture, and political activism. So please make notes if there's anything that I've touched on that you feel like you'd like to cover in depth in what I hope will be a robust Q&A. So let's begin with that view from 50,000 feet. So now that we carry image archives around with us in our pocket computers, ephemera moves at the speed of light and across a landscape of Mobius non-orientability. Boosted by digital accelerants, centuries of suppositions based on the Enlightenment still linger, even as the evanescence of social media neutralizes its vestigial prerequisites, like the concepts of reason or truth. the visual evidence of which is increasingly contested. And so I believe the earliest predicament of the 21st century might be best described as an image dilemma. How do we discern what is actual and what is not in this environment, where AI is able to fabricate and mutate photo documentation in a machine-learned zeptosecond? Within a rapidly intensifying digital commons, how do we perform participation when we can't really exactly know what we're participating in? How do we map the tensions between access and limitation, literacy and legibility, marking and erasure, identity and colonization, or agency and refusal? When the parameters of our social landscape are being dismantled, how do we mount an effective resistance to it? And finally, if we can't believe our eyes anymore, what actual use is a culture based on images? America's no longer actually a country in the traditional sense. It's instead a digitized procession of content, symbols, archetypes, and codes. It's an aggregate articulation of the false promise between America's guarantees of abundance, between its promise and its cruelty. This vacillation presents as a flexing of hegemonies, but it's far too potent to be strictly described as the institutional side effects of America's false promises. I've come to believe that our current cultural turning point is not simply a digital translation of those prior Enlightenment ideas. It's actually, it's not just a digital translation of these power narratives that have defined Western European hierarchies for centuries, designed for handheld, our pocket computers. I think it's far too potent to be strictly described as the institutional side effects of these false guarantees of abundance. What maps the parameters of America's current social spaces is far more primordial. To be sure, America's promise and cruelty is codified in increasingly novel ways as a result of digital technologies, but it also represents deeper predicaments that are age-old. In my estimation, advertising vernaculars have become the folk language of capitalism. A folk language being loosely defined in my terms as an agreed upon language centered on usage through which we're expected to engage with a theoretically shared experience of ourselves within heavily mediated social spaces. But like most folk languages, it doesn't actually reflect cultural truths. It's a language that reflects our beliefs about ourselves. According to Coca-Cola, this is how we wanted to see ourselves in 1971. Young, of differing origins as seen through the scrim of white imagination at that point in time, singing together on a hill with soda. This television ad, if you Google it, if you haven't seen it, it's mind-blowing. This television ad was so popular, its jingle was released as a pop song. However, in the jingle, it said the words, the lyrics are, "I'd like to buy the world a Coke." When it hit the music charts, they changed it to, "I'd like to buy the world a home." Here in the 21st century, not everyone can have a home. You can, however, personalize your very own bottle of Coke as a way to celebrate your individual identity. So what is this reversal telling us about ourselves? Whether you think about it this way or not, our image commons is a highly tuned series of focus groups conducted by sponsors who have one simple objective in mind: culling messages we will already respond to, belonging, identity, communal meaning, before feeding it back to us to sell us products, services, celebrities, candidates, or ideas. We're inundated with images, but we're not really given the ability to understand them. We're not universally trained in image literacy. Here at Yale, we are. But it's difficult for most people to actually discern the meanings of what they're looking at. And so without realizing it, we atomize the commons every time we click on the phrase, "I accept these terms and conditions" on our pocket computers, in exchange for which we're delivered a steady stream of egalitarian fantasias about connectivity, agreement, and commonality. On this image commons, access is participation, and it's the only agency we really need to express. Our national identity is simultaneously dismantled and reassembled by tropes based on who we are told we are. As a consequence, pop culture is far more than mere entertainment. It's in fact a power narrative, the same way that Western European aesthetics were before it. It's a narrative of race, gender, capital, and class, but we no longer need the Medici to reinforce Western hegemonies. We simply swipe right. The image commons of late-stage capitalism is a feedback loop, or more accurately, it's a forced feedback loop. When you consider that we're constantly and instantly served ads based on algorithmic analyses of our searches, our cell phones function in much the same way as highly targeted focus groups do, but with one distinctive additional feature. They are also micro-targeted surveillance devices. And so if advertising is the folk language of capitalism, the internet is a densely layered folktale gone wild. It's a feeding tube to nourish the hive. It's a 21st century throwdown between the heavily massaged, subsidized storytelling that floods our social spaces and the commons that we're trained to believe it depicts. It's a commons that doubles as a twisted surface on which to display the mission creep of late-stage capitalism and its storytelling. And so the topography of the 21st century image commons is not a flat plane. Instead, it's a landscape that has torqued our imaginings of where and how we appear in it. Even the seemingly spontaneous, crowdsourced zeitgeist of social media is trapped within this same perpetual motion and feedback loop. And it serves to mirror the images and texts cycling through us all day, every day. This egalitarian fantasia of interactivity is actually the mask of participation. But it can be more accurately described, in my humble opinion, as a pre-buy of goods and services, in much the same way that voting for your favorite singer on The Voice is an indication to the recording industry of potential advanced album sales. And it's one that simultaneously surrenders your data for follow-up marketing. It's a service but not to you. It's a service to potential investors that signifies financial viability. In much the same way that polling data on political candidates paints a picture of viability for the political donor class. There is no corner of the digital commons, of the image commons, that's immune to the deployment of images as a reification of institutional objectives. As a result, staging political discourse in late stage American capitalism in particular is to be trapped in a skirmish between topic and telling along this increasingly permeable border between the commons and the images that we use to represent it. If you haven't seen John Carpenter's 1988 film, They Live, these billboard images are from that movie, and you need to Google it. You need to download it. So images are funny things, though. They're the driving force in an image culture. So we think we know everything there is to know about them, but they're simply the givens of a media landscape. They're the sky, rocks, and trees. And most of us barely think twice about them as they pass over us, like the background in a cartoon. We believe we understand how images work, and here at Yale, we probably do. But most information audiences are not given the tools to consider them critically, even images that come to identify us. And so this is why I say the contemporary question of post-factuality remains the most critical example of the image dilemma that I referred to as I began my talk, largely because we are in its slipstream and have difficulty staying afloat within this rapidly shifting meanings. It's too evanescent to hold in our hands, but it's too destructive to risk letting go of it. History has little power to help us here in and of itself. Critical thinking, however, does. It's the only way we can trace the outlines of meaning is by thinking critically about the images that we're handed. Because what we're looking at is still under formation, it's not yet an object that casts a clear enough shadow that we can all agree on what it is. We can't draw fixed assumptions about something that has not yet solidified. What we have instead is a series of gestures. And how I would refer to those series of gestures is that we have a historiography, history that is under construction. So perhaps recent American histories can, in fact, offer us clues. The images associated with HIV/AIDS provide a useful matrix for this. But even the story of HIV/AIDS has long since been replaced by its storytelling. The internet mashups of this cultural production converts the AIDS past into memes. We inhabit a world of such accelerated content consumptions that scholarly consideration, which attempts to deepen our understanding of AIDS, simply cannot outpace how we talk about it in our cultural wilds. And as a consequence, any meaning made of silence equals death within academia lies in the penumbra of the 95-foot video wall made of it by U2's production designer during the band's 2015 tour. So I want to take a critical look at silence equals death. When I was 16, I learned how to silkscreen while being conscripted to reproduce the May '68 student strike posters at the Quaker school in the town where I grew up. In 1981, the man I was building my life around started showing signs of immunosuppression before AIDS even had its name. By 1984, he was dead, before Rock Hudson was outed by the disease and died. I felt very alone. So in late 1985, I started a men's consciousness raising group with 5 friends to consider AIDS that was loosely assembled around feminist organizing principles. Based on my experience as a student activist using the street posters as a means to communicate, and since there was very little conversation in New York City at that point in time about the political implications of AIDS, there was lots of support work, there was a lot of community work being done, but very little political conversation. So I proposed we make a street poster about it. We finished the poster in late 1986 and began posting it in commercial spaces in early 1987. This is an image of how it sat alongside announcements for commercial concerns, concerts. We purposefully wanted to intrude into a commercial space to have a conversation that we felt no one was having, but was critically important. I had no idea when we did this what might happen, but I was pretty sure we couldn't be the only ones who were enraged. What I discovered, of course, is that we weren't. Within weeks of mounting our posters in New York, literally, we started mounting them in end of February, because that's when it stops raining a little bit and before everyone starts leaving the city for weekends in the summer. It was literally within weeks of mounting the posters. We found ourselves surrounded by a community of AIDS activists that formed ACT UP, the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, which was a community that none of us realized existed until we were all out on the streets together. We weren't the only ones who were enraged. But after decades of popular storytelling about this moment, however, Silence Equals Death is thought of and referred to loosely as the ACT UP logo, even though, as I've just explained to you, it wasn't designed for that activist group, which didn't exist yet. And it wasn't designed by that activist group. It was a handful of people who decided to put a poster in the street. So I think, in fact, the real story here is some hybridized version that's sort of the reverse of that truth. The image existed before ACT UP, and it might have come and gone in the night without anyone seeing it, without the meaning given to it through the political work of ACT UP. More to the point, however, calling Silence Equals Death a logo frames it in the language of capitalism. Now, my bad, we were imitating the language of capitalism, so it's no surprise that it would have been confused in this way. But equating ACT UP with Apple is an incorrect assumption. That isn't what was happening. People were dying in hospital corridors. That's why this poster was made. It isn't really a logo. So regardless, I'm often asked to speak about how the AIDS activist movement became so effectively branded, but describing the political posters associated with ACT UP New York as having branded AIDS activism not only reduces them to mechanisms of capital, which is inaccurate, it shadows their continued political potency as gestures of resistance to capital. And it strips away layers of potential use from future activists. And in spite of a generation of exploration by scholars attempting to draw attention to the many AIDS counter-narratives within feminist, queer, and African-American studies, explorations which are finally being included in this course, for instance, in how we talk about the ongoing pandemic, we still struggle to adapt to the ways the media skims across these questions. For example, I believe Alex has already had this conversation with you, the way it covered the protests, centering the anemic representation of Black artists in the Art AIDS America exhibition in Tacoma, or its lack of probative interest in how that even came to be true. But the key dilemma presented by the construction of an AIDS historiography is not simply how it talks about AIDS in the present or in the future. It's founded in the fact of its having been built on a speciously laid foundation from the beginning. This mediated storytelling that's thrown off every plumb line of how we think about this question, since we were first handed the phrase GRID, which stood for gay-related immune deficiency. This hybridized account that we've come to popularly accept as the history of AIDS is an account that actually torques our understanding towards one tiny but appealing corner of it. This account is not without meaning, but it's been shaped through popular discourse into a dominant narrative that suits political and economic power structures, specifically that AIDS ended with the advent of protease inhibitors. There are, what, 36 million people living with HIV in the world? It's not over. Without references to the political context that helped form agitprop like silence equals death, it becomes a sock puppet deployed as proof of the efficacy of democracy, specifically as a signifier that dissent works in capitalism, which in turn opens the door for the history of AIDS to become a saga shaped through popular discourse into a dominant narrative that serves these political and economic power structures in a way that's predicated on the presumed neutrality of whiteness and patentable pharmaceutical property rights. Detaching political cultural production from the political agency that produced it hobbles its historiographic uses and tosses the potential for counter-narratives out the window. Let me give you an example. References to silence equals death that overlook work within the feminist health movement, which preceded ACT UP, reifies the power structures that silence equals death was designed to call into question. On December 28, 1977, Audre Lorde delivered a talk that was later published called The Transformation of Silence into Language. You should read it, it's startling. She gave this talk at the Lesbian and Literature panel at the annual Modern Language Association conference in 1977. Lorde was reflecting on her own struggle with cancer. And in it, she comes to the conclusion, quote, "Your silence will not protect you." The Silence Equals Death collective came to the question of silence from a queer Jewish perspective, in particular the Holocaust. But considering how intertwined the women's health movement was with AIDS activism, really affords us a deeper historical analysis of each of them, of both of them. The correlations between Lord and silence equals death, or silence equals death and the George Floyd protests are not incidental. Cultural production used in social justice activism is situated on a continuum. Each time we activate our shared spaces, this continuum is what we're standing on as we do it. And every activist attempt at articulating the need for social justice expands that landscape. Sorry, I lost my cursor. Let me give you another example. In his 1995 essay for But Is It Art, the art historian Richard Meyer drew a very elegant line between The Government Has Blood on Its Hands by Gran and John Hartfeld's 1928 poster, A Hand Has Five Fingers. This analysis by Meyer situated this poster within the history of agitprop, favoring a historical reference to its significance over an explanation of the political circumstances surrounding the making of this poster by Gran. It may have been in the minds of some of us in Gran, but I can tell you that Hartfeld never entered into the discussion when we were working on this series of posters. So I'd like to describe that specific political question that led to this poster's production, and you'll see why I think understanding the activist reasoning behind it expands the way in which we think about the history of resistance, the history of graphics, the history of political posters, that some of these images are used to represent. In October 1988, ACT UP decided to target the regulatory agency responsible for the testing of potential AIDS therapies in the US, the Food and Drug Administration. You've all heard of it during the COVID pandemic. At the time, very few people thought about the FDA, I can tell you. Given the high and rapid mortality rate of people living with AIDS, it became clear that any risks the medications carried could not exceed the risks of non-intervention, and that the clinical trials for the safety and efficacy of these drugs became de facto healthcare for individuals confronting the then fatal disease. When Gran created the National Bloody Hand poster for the FDA action, it was actually based on an earlier poster, an earlier Bloody Hand poster we did for a campaign targeting the Commissioner of Health in New York City. On July 19th, 1988, 6 months before the FDA action, the New York City Commissioner of Health, Stephen Joseph, suddenly slashed the number of estimated AIDS cases in New York City, a move that drastically threatened and reduced funding for AIDS services in New York. The cut was purportedly based on cohort studies in San Francisco's gay community, but the data he drew on was also rumored to have come through a position paper from a right-wing think tank that decided the Kinsey Institute estimates of the number of gay Americans, that it called that number into question. ACT UP was not having any of it and declared war on him. During a sit-in at Stephen Joseph's office, a copy of his itinerary was taken, and it became the basis for a campaign spearheaded by an ACT UP affinity group. Affinity groups are smaller groups within a larger organization that work collectively. The affinity group Surrender Dorothy was named after the sky-written threat by the witch in The Wizard of Oz. This itinerary was largely circulated throughout ACT UP, and we followed Stephen Joseph day and night to public and private meetings, to forums, to lunches, to dinners, and it occasionally even led us outside of his residence. The pursuit of Joseph was so public and so relentless, it became somewhat high profile here in New York, creating skirmishes between local gossips and news columnists over whether our pursuit of the commissioner could be considered fair. Several Grand Theory members were involved in the effort to remove Joseph from office, myself included. Grand Theory produced the bloody handprint image as a poster to support that campaign, the war against Stephen Joseph. We made two versions, one directed at Stephen Joseph and the other directed at the then mayor, Ed Koch. The posters were repasted around New York City by members of Grand Theory and the ACT UP membership. To support this poster campaign, Grand Theory organized a very small budget. There were actually two of us in Grand Theory who organized this budget, and brought buckets of red paint and rubber gloves to the floor of ACT UP to instigate a parallel graffiti campaign of bloody handprints throughout Lower Manhattan to go to places where posters just couldn't, and reinforcing the image's ubiquity. It seemed like an impactful extension of personal agency and an inexpensive way to expand the poster campaign beyond the confines of print, beyond the walls we could attach the posters to, and to illustrate the consequences of this inequality in a very visceral way. Activists across the globe have proven the standalone efficacy of this strategy, of this image, of this effective image, and its universality, its universal adaptability to questions of race, colonization, and political culpability lives to this day. Here, it's deployed to protest violence against Indigenous women. Here, it was used to protest Putin's invasion of Ukraine. And most recently, it's turned up in protests against Palestinian occupation. But Grand Fury didn't invent the handprint, which has been found in cave paintings throughout France and Spain. That's what this image is, cave painting. And silence equals death was not the first reference to silence. The potency of images that mirror corporeality is primordial. Within political organizing strategies, activists register their political agency through the use of their bodies, which is precisely the point of marches and of civil disobedience. Sometimes the body, sorry graphics people, and I'm one of you, sometimes the body or images of it is all you need to effectuate change. So before we break for discussion, let me offer a few final thoughts and prompts. I don't know if you know this, but when the Department of Defense began funding the research that eventually led to the internet, DARPA, it likely never imagined that the internet would permanently distort the American electoral process, the American Commons, by conjoining a reality television presidency with the trolling of Russia's spy state. On the same social media platforms that brought us the Kardashians. But it did. And so Trumpism has more in common with Meta than it does with any vestigial remains of the Republican Party. We hate to admit that pop culture is much more than mere entertainment. It's a power narrative. But it's important to keep this in mind, that no matter how flummoxed our old media punditocracy appears to be about America's authoritarian turn, the storyline is actually quite simple. The tools that helped dismantle the American Commons, in my humble opinion, dismantle the American Commons, were not catapulted from foreign shores. They were made here in America by the Department of Defense and became firmly rooted here decades before social media. I've become very interested, in fact, obsessed with the idea that Guy Debord and Marshall McLuhan wrote their two seminal works that were about the television age in the same year. McLuhan, I think, was embracing it, whereas Debord was criticizing it. But I think it's also interesting to note that any perspective that might have guided our understanding of it existed outside of America. We made it, we weren't thinking about it, and here we are. I also think it's worth thinking about that at the turn of the 20th century, the rising modernist age ushered in waves of graphic representations of egalitarianism, radically changing our ideas of what political engagement might actually look like. And this might have been largely responsible for the making of 20th century social movements. It might have made it possible, the poster as a political work, a possibility. The digital age picked up on that, of course, but on steroids. Still, as I said earlier, our image literacy, and when I use our, I'm not referring to people on this Zoom, I'm referring to the culture at large. Our image literacy lags so far behind the technology, and we've yet to catch up with it. I think perhaps it's because we misread what information technology actually is. It's sure, the smartphone is a state-of-the-art computer, but it's really also just a content delivery system, the same way broadsheets were before the turn of the century. Graphics designers and activists concerned with political communication don't care if we choose an iPhone or a Galaxy, if we choose a broadsheet or a flyer. We care about what's on them. We care about content. Content is what moves the commons. Content cradles everything, from war to Taylor Swift, from Trump to writers against the war in Gaza. There can be no expression of political agency without ideas to propel it. Content solidifies movement, not posters. And content is what sustains them. Content is power, which is why power structures control to struggle it the way they do. In the 21st century, it's a power we carry with us everywhere, all day. Content is power. So it's only natural that our ideas about what political engagement even looks like would change radically and change on a daily basis. But I don't believe we should be panicked by that. I think we should ignore what we're being told. We are not witnessing the end of civilization. It feels that way, but that isn't what's happening. It's the genesis of what 21st century social movements might look like.
Thank you so much, Abram.